Let me say, by way of introducing our guests this evening, that journalists, as a general rule, have an aversion to becoming the story. They prefer to keep the focus on the stories that they're covering. And that certainly has been Judy Miller's preference as a veteran journalist. But a decade ago, Judy ended up the subject of not one but two big controversies, one involving the question of Iraq's alleged possession and pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, and the other involving the disclosure of Valerie Plame as a CIA operative. Judy is here this evening to discuss those experiences and much more, all chronicled in her new memoir, The Story, A Reporter's Journey. The book covers the full span of Judy's long, accomplished career in journalism, and nearly 3 decades of which were with the New York Times. She joined the paper's Washington bureau in 1977, then spent the mid-1980s abroad in Cairo and Paris, returning to Washington to serve as an editor and special correspondent. Stories about Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda that she and a small team of others did in 2001, before and immediately after the 9/11 attacks, won a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory journalism. During the run-up to the Iraq War and in the months after the 2003 invasion, Judy wrote a number of high-profile articles about Iraq's alleged WMD efforts, articles that later turned out to have been based on wrong information. She came under fire by many critics, both outside and inside the Times, for her reporting. In 2004 and 2005, she ended up embroiled in further controversy, this time over the Plame case, and was jailed for nearly 3 months for defending a reporter's right to protect sources and refusing to testify before a grand jury. In late 2005, Judy left the Times. In 2008, she joined Fox News as a commentator, and she's also now an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of the Institute's magazine, City Journal, and a theater reporter with Tablet Magazine. Have I got that right? Right, okay. Theater critic, right.
Everybody's a critic.
The Story is Judy's 5th book. Her others have dealt with biological weapons, the First Gulf War, or the Holocaust. Judy was just remarking when we were talking in the office about how she happens to pick such lighthearted subjects, right? Judy's story, or stories really, raise important questions about the practice of journalism, about relationships between reporters and sources, and between reporters and editors, especially when classified or highly sensitive information is involved, and decisions about whether to take a nation to war are at stake. So there's certainly a lot to discuss this evening. Judy will be in conversation with Bill Drozdiak, who is an old friend of mine and of Judy's, and was a talented foreign correspondent and foreign editor during his 20 years with the Washington Post. He went on to lead the Transatlantic Center of the German Marshall Fund and the American Council on Germany. And recently he became a senior fellow at Brookings, and he serves as a senior advisor for Europe with McClarty Associates. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Judy Miller and Bill Drozdiak.
Well, thank you very much, Brad, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be in the company of good friends and to mark the occasion of Judy's latest book. I thought we'd start out with just some softball questions about how you got into journalism, because I'm sure we'll have plenty of time going to the audience to talk about some of the more controversial aspects of your career. But I suppose everybody, behind every journalist, there is a series of mentors or inspirational people. I understand you started in journalism with The Progressive, a publication out of Madison, Wisconsin, at the height of the protests against Vietnam. Larry Stern was a close friend and editor. Tell me a little bit about that early phase of your career.
Well, back then I was a a graduate student who had decided that I was never going to be an economist because it was too boring even for me. And since I hated the sight of blood, I couldn't be a doctor, and I thought that journalism would be an interesting way to spend one's life. I had no idea how interesting it would be. But I started doing freelance stories, and Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School, where I was a graduate student, sent me to the Middle East for a summer, which many universities did back then.
Where in the Middle East?
I started out in Israel, and then I got really hooked. And with the Arab-Israeli conflict, I went. In those days, if people forget, we had to go to Cyprus because there was no direct connection between Israel and any Arab country. And so I flew to Cyprus. I went to Egypt. People told me there was going to be a war. This is 1972. I wasn't reading that in the American papers. I was interested in that. I went to Jordan. I met King Hussein for the first time. I tried to interview him with a tape recorder, and I didn't know how it worked, and he wound up starting it for me. And that became the beginning of a very long-standing friendship, and I admired him enormously. And Beirut and Syria. And then I came back to Princeton and decided I really didn't want to do economics. I wanted to be a journalist, and Woodward and Bernstein were still kind of the heroes of the day, and I came to Washington to try and get a job and found the Progressive. And a mentor of mine, an early mentor, was I.F. Stone. And Izzy was nothing if not skeptical. I mean, he was Mr. Skepticism, and just would say every day when I'd go to him with some problem or some national security challenge that only the government could solve, he would say, just remember, they all lie. Doesn't matter, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, they all lie, and they always will. And the only thing you can depend on is what they put in their documents. Sometimes, he said, and he would go through them religiously. And he was a great source of inspiration. So when I got to the Times, I was hired at the New York Times because of affirmative action. The women of the New York Times 3 years earlier had sued the paper and for sexual discrimination. I have to tell you, their case was rock solid. There were no women columnists. There were no women, on and on and on. There were no women. There were 3 women out of 35 people in the Washington Bureau. And all of a sudden, people like me began being hired. It was my good fortune to come along at the right time. But I always wanted to go back to the Middle East and write about the Middle East. And in 1982, Abe Rosenthal sent me there. So another mentor and inspiration, along with Bill Safire, a conservative columnist with whom I adamantly disagreed. We agreed on only one thing, which was the importance of journalism to keeping Americans informed. On that we agreed.
Right. Well, that's something we share sometime in Cairo. Since that was your first big foreign assignment, how did that change you, your perspective as a person, on your views about the Middle East, and also about the way to cover it as a journalist?
I think what I had discovered when I was a student was that the story oftentimes wasn't the major story that everybody was writing about. It was about, in Israel, this group called Gush Emunim. They were the first group of people to form illegal settlers, illegal settlements. And yet, I think I wrote one of the first early pieces for the Progressive before I even joined the Times about the importance of people who felt that the land was more important than the rule of law. And I saw great peril in this approach and wrote that. Then when I got to Egypt full-time, the first big story I had was not in Egypt. It was in Beirut in 1983. When the Marine compound was blown up. And that's when I encountered terrorism for the first time in my life. And Beirut being Beirut, rather than have a nice cordon sanitaire, with an area that had been a bomb site roped off. It was utter chaos. And I had flown to Israel because Lebanon was closed. They had closed all of the borders. They'd closed the airport. But I flew to Israel and persuaded a Lebanese friend who went back and forth to take me with him. So I got there just at dawn as they were digging out American bodies from the rubble. And that was the first time I understood what we were up against. We all heard the story of the smiling Shiite driver in the yellow Mercedes who had smiled as he drove through the compound doors, and we didn't understand what that was all about. It would be a long time before we understood what jihadis believed about the afterlife and how important it would be to do something that was memorable and important in their sense of the word. So from there, that's where my interest in Islamic militancy began, and that directed the rest of my reporting for the next 3 years, actually for the next 20 years.
So that, if I recall correctly, I think the assassin, the suicide bomber, was guided from Tehran.
Tehran,
Yeah.
absolutely.
And was it? I mean, that was early days of Hezbollah, and
Hezbollah was just being formed, and there was a lot of misinformation, and a lot of us, wrote stories that turned out to be partly true, not true. It was very hard to figure out what was going on in that very chaotic period. But I knew, as I was standing there that day in the rubble, that this was not going to stop with Beirut. And lo and behold, 2 months later, I was standing in another rubble, the American Embassy in Kuwait. Fortunately, nobody was killed because the area that was bombed, where the suicide bomber had come through, was a place where the chancery, where people had stopped working. So we were hugely lucky that more Americans weren't killed there. But I began to see it again and again and again in different groups that we tended to lump together with one term, Islamic fundamentalism. But I knew they were all different, and they were motivated by some of the same things, but all politics are local. So I had to go to each country to figure out what motivated that particular group.
so you in your reporting, you found that the causes were different for this kind of suicidal, maniacal kind of Islamic jihadism.
The goal was the same, to establish the caliphate or the restoration of Islamic rule. The methods, the grievances, the method of organization, the way, the MO was different everywhere. And for example, people always said that Israel was a really important factor in this. Well, it was if you were on the West Bank or Gaza or in an area, in a refugee camp, the immediate surrounding areas. But if I went to Morocco and Algeria and Tunis, they really didn't care about Israel. It was just not a factor in what they wanted to do. And so I began to be enormously wary about these broad generalizations, and that led to my book, God Has 99 Names, which I always love that about Islam, 99 names. There's actually 100, but one is unknowable or known only to God. So, but I once again, it was the broad generalizations that frightened me, except there was one thing that the critics and the people who worried about it got right, which was, do not think this is going to stay in the Middle East. This will not be confined to the Middle East. And they were right about that.
It must have been particularly difficult as a woman reporter, a Western woman reporter covering the Middle East, or were there hidden advantages?
There were many hidden advantages. Not only did I get my job through affirmative action, but in those days when you were at risk, not only because you were tall, but women weren't kidnapped and we weren't killed. It was Arab chivalry, Islamic chivalry. They didn't do to us what they did to some of you. And there was also the kind of what I called the Saudi USC syndrome, where you would go to Saudi Arabia where women couldn't drive, had to sit in the back of the bus. I did that. It's not fun because the back of the bus isn't air conditioned at 120 degrees. Can't really work with men. we all know the conditions now. But I was an honorary man for the time that I was there. And the American-trained Saudi officials would bend over backwards to show how enlightened and Western they were. And I had extraordinary access because I was a woman. So this gender thing plays both ways. Once again, it's always the generalization that tends to be wrong.
All right. What interested you in weapons of mass destruction? You wrote about germs, biological warfare, as Brad sort of
Right, the
suggested.
happy subjects, Brad.
Yeah,
Thank
you seem to be drawn to grisly ways of dying.
Yeah, and you know, it was so crazy because I'd been so blessed. I mean, my life was really lucky. I had a wealthy, talented father, a brother who was a great musician, grew up comfortable, but I grew up part of the time in Las Vegas where my father owned nightclubs and ran nightclubs, and I didn't realize until the time sent me back to Las Vegas after 2001 to look at what we were using the Nevada test site for and to write a series of articles there. I didn't realize that I had actually, and that's when I remembered this, I had actually grown up during the period of there for about 4 years of open air testing. And I remembered seeing one of the tests. I mean, Las Vegas, remember, is only 60 miles away from the place where we did most of our above ground testing and most of our underground testing too. And I remember the bomb very much being a part of my childhood. I write about this in the book. I begged my mother to take us to J.C. Penney, which had just donated a set of clothing that was going to be used in the Apple bombings. The Pentagon wanted to see what would happen to mannequins who were dressed up in regular clothes inside the houses they built, which you can still see today. If you go out to the Nevada test site, they have tours, which I highly recommend once a month. And you saw, they said they detonated a bomb, and you saw the mannequins. I mean, the mannequins are gone, but they have pictures of what was left, and it is a horrific, absolutely horrific scene. And the Atomic Testing Museum in Las Vegas actually lets you sit on a bench the way our soldiers did and feel the rumble of the earth. They've recreated that and what the sky looked like. And all of a sudden it kind of came back to me. And I realized where my interest in weapons of mass destruction had come from. Never mind the fact that we were systematically lied to about what the effects of radiation were. I mean, that was, I think, part of the reason I wanted to write about this was that I knew that a lot of what we were being told was not right. So, hence, some of my early pieces for the Progressive were very skeptical of national security justifications for some of the weapons we were developing, neutron bomb, things like that.
And did you connect it in those days to your interest in the Middle East and start asking yourself what will happen if some suicidal religious fanatic gets his or her hands on weapons of mass destruction?
Yeah, that's when that occurred to me. And then in 1991, when I got trapped in Saudi Arabia, I wasn't chosen to be part of the team that covered the war, but I was interviewing prominent Saudis when the war broke out and the Saudis closed their airspace. So I was trapped there for 3 months. And it was great to be trapped in Saudi Arabia for 3 months because the men sent all of their wives and families to Mecca, which Saddam would never bomb, they thought. And I got to hang out with them. And I finally had a chance to kind of really talk to Saudis in an unguarded moment where they felt vulnerable. They knew that if Saddam won, they were in big trouble. And it gave me an insight into Saudi Arabia that I'd never had before, though I'd been there many times. But I remember one of them telling me about this mad Saudi named Osama bin Laden from a very wealthy family who was running around with his charts and his graphs showing how we didn't need the infidels. we didn't need these people. Get them out of here. They're soiling our holy land, and we can fight this war ourselves. And then I encountered him by reputation again in Afghanistan, when I went in as a guest of the Taliban to see what life under the Taliban was like.
And that would have been when? In the mid-'80s?
Yeah, it was 1991 was the war, and then I went to Taliban Afghanistan in 2000, before 2001.
And it was in Afghanistan that
he would
Bin
have really,
Laden and others,
Yes.
the Mujahideen, had been trained by, among
By
others,
him.
by American special forces.
I don't know if we trained his group, but we trained Mujahideen like him. And I remember having an argument with a great friend of mine who wanted to be here, but she's traveling today. She's a superb diplomat, Ambassador Frances Cook. She had been given a tour of the Taliban, of the Mujahideen that the CIA was training, and she said, "Boy, these are my kind of holy warriors." And I remember saying to her, I'm just really nervous about the notion of any holy warrior, because they tend to forget that all of virtue and wisdom are not on their side, and this could be problematic for us. And also, I'd encountered them in Egypt because they were blowing up government ministries and government officials there. So I knew how this translated, and I was always worried about it. And I badgered the Times into letting me do this series on this guy, Al-Qaeda, with my good friend and former colleague Jeff Girth. We did the first piece for the New York Times. I think it was in 1997, I'm not sure, about Osama bin Laden becoming more than a financier, but an operator of terror.
Right.
And that was really...
That whole phenomenon of blowback was very impressively reported in Steve Call's book, Ghost War.
Wonderful book. Marvelous book.
Then... for example, Saddam, there was a period of time when he was actually considered a so-called friend of the United States. I mean, were you covering him in those days?
Yes.
In the early 80s, I believe, even Donald Rumsfeld went to Baghdad and asked how we could help in terms of the fighting against Iran. And Saddam was then touted as a socialist, secular bulwark against the spread of Islamic fundamentalism, and women went to universities in Baghdad.
Right.
Studied. So, what did you think in those days about?
I thought my first trip to Iraq was in, I think, 1976 or 1977, when Saddam was there, but had not quite consolidated. He was consolidating power, and as much as I was suspicious of Islamic militants, I really didn't like Saddam, because every writer was under pressure or in jail. Any dissident, any artist, even people who had galleries were terrified of the Muhabarat. They would come in, they would take what they wanted. It was a nightmare from the beginning. And each time I went back, and I went about 20 times to Iraq because I had the misfortune of covering the Iran-Iraq war when I was in Egypt, it just got worse and worse. And then sanctions went on, and children began to starve, and it was an absolute mess. One of the first another series of articles I worked on with the inimitable Bill Broad, who is a great science reporter for the New York Times, who was co-author of my next book, Germs, on biological weapons. We looked at Saddam's biological weapons program, and weirdly enough, that was the program that he hid the longest. It wasn't the nukes. We didn't realize that he destroyed them after Israel had bombed his reactor, but that they never were able to really rebuild the program. But the biology was very important to him, and so Bill and I got to work with international inspectors who had come back from Iraq, and they were telling us about the program, and that resulted in another really interesting investigation. But after watching Saddam for so many years, he could have told me the sun rose in the east and set in the west, and I wouldn't have believed it. He was a monster, and just on human rights grounds alone. I could not figure out why the United States was embracing him.
What then led to, you must have tracked his efforts to acquire weapons of mass destruction, and particularly, remember in covering the Iran-Iraq war, he was already using chemical weapons then, and eventually against his own people. But I remember that he would be using insecticide against the Basij who were coming across the marshes in the south, and then finally against his own people, the Kurds, in the north. Which,
in Halabja. Which was another massacre that I covered.
Tell us a little bit about that. Peter Galbraith and others have
Peter Galbraith
documented that very well.
A great man for getting helping to get the Iraqi official government documents of that massacre, because the Iraqis were kind of like the Germans. They took exquisite records of everything. So they had these. They were proud of what they called Anfal, their campaign, their genocidal campaign against the Kurds, and they had documented it in detail, village by village, house by house, what was used where, how it was delivered, how many kills there were. It was just horrific, and for me, I wrote a front page cover story based on those documents, which Peter got me some access to. The DIA and Human Rights Watch were working together to translate these documents and get the word out about the Iraqi genocide. And I remember seeing pictures. I had left by then. I had gone to one of the sites in Halabja, but I remember seeing the pictures of this woman who had been taken out of a grave, and she was still frozen, holding her baby. Both of them frozen in time. And I thought, this guy is beyond the pale. Mm-hmm. And, there was resolution after resolution after resolution, and Saddam always thought that he could buy off the West, bribe the Russians, seduce the Germans and the Europeans with lucrative contracts, and by and large, he was right. He did it for a long, long time.
Good. We have about 10 or 15 minutes, so I want to open it up to questions from the audience. And in the interest in time, I'll try to group 2, maybe 3. So please ask.
Actually, we have a little longer than that. I meant about 10 more minutes.
Of the conversation. All right, well, we can already start opening up. So please ask a question, and so we leave enough time for everybody to have a shot at this. Who would like to start?
Here's one.
Right here.
Hi.
Okay.
I actually came here expecting to hear more about your problems with the deceit and the pressures that you felt when you were trying to report on weapons of mass destruction. In other words, it's as important for us to understand ourselves and our own deceit. And that's what I really was hoping you'd talk about. And one other part of that I'd just ask, if there's ever going to be any sense of proper operation and governing anywhere at any time, there has to be some higher level of openness and light into what is going on, because we're fed stuff and we cannot make good decisions if we don't see what's going on in these offices and at these lunches and so forth. And that really, anytime a governing person is dealing with governing matters, that should be accessible to us. And it's not. We're far from it.
Right. Well, you touched on one of the big challenges for any journalist, how to penetrate the deceit that one gets from public officials who are either trying to cover it up to protect their own record or just simply to lie. So what?
Well, I take one of the reasons I wrote this book is I wanted to look at this meme, "They lied, people died," which so many Americans still believe. It fits on a bumper sticker. But we know now from exhaustive reports from the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, bipartisan, and in this case, pretty pretty nonpartisan, the Rob Silverman report from Charles Silver's exhaustive examination of WMD, that it was worse than a lie. The intelligence agencies, the 16 of them that are paid billions of dollars a year, got it wrong. And they got it wrong for understandable reasons. I think for the same reasons that we journalists got it, some of us got it wrong, almost all of us got it wrong. And that's because this area, working in this area, in understanding a foreign country's weapons programs, is one of the hardest things there is to do. Because you have real live human beings, oftentimes. I mean, the sources and methods hides what's really going on here, which is people overseas putting their lives at risk to tell us things. And they assemble this information and they combine it with what satellites are able to collect and photographs from the air are able to find and detection of various kinds, and they make a guess at programs that a foe or someone we're watching has. And it's so hard to do. And they get it wrong so often. And I think part of what happened, and part of what I write about in this book, is that there was pressure on these analysts, but not the kind that people think. No one was telling them to write that Saddam had WMD when they didn't believe it. They believed it. And one of the reasons they believed it was not only for what I've been talking to you about here, is that they knew Saddam and they knew the program, they knew the history. But beyond that, they believed it because the last time they'd been asked to do an estimate, they had underestimated the threat. And Saddam turned out to be closer to a nuclear bomb than they had said. And they were not going to underestimate a threat again after 9/11. Now, I can't, look, these were people whom I had dealt with since I first started writing about WMD. They were right about bin Laden's programs very early, but they were there. They were right about about biological and chemical. They were ultimately right about the Soviet Union and the fact that the CIA had pretty much missed a program which was 60,000 people in dozens of institutions throughout Russia, the Soviet Union at that point. They had not really understood the depth and breadth of the program until defectors came out from the program and said, this is really bad. So if you're that analyst in government, and so much depends on you after 9/11, are you going to underestimate, or are you going to tell the president, wow, you got to worry here? So I have, and because these people had been so right for so long, and because they were oftentimes some of the few people who said, that bin Laden guy, I think he's real problems for us, and they were laughed out of the room, I believed them. And I get really angry when people say they lied, people died, because they didn't lie. It was worse than that. It's so hard to figure this out. We can't have a lot of confidence that we're going to get it right, even now.
Okay. Next question.
Thanks.
I guess they're lining up, so if you want to ask a question, just wait your turn.
Yeah, the question is about kind of independence of journalists, and I guess the succinct statement of the question would be, how does a journalist avoid acquiring a partisan bias? And the I guess my reason I'm asking that question is it seems, timely now especially. Sort of a sub-question is that notion of independence sort of obsolete or naive? To what extent do you think that's the case? It seems to me that it's probably a bigger problem over time for a journalist rather than at any one point in time. That is, if you're gradually assumed to be sort of biased, even gently so, in one direction, that there may be some tendency for that to, accelerate or whatever. Anyway, any comments on that problem?
These are really
And
good
on
questions.
the assumption, is it an obsolete assumption?
No, well, it's getting to be an obsolete assumption. Our American press is becoming more like the European press, where you pick up a European newspaper, as Bill and I have done for so long, and you're reading Libby, you're reading a left of center publication. You pick up in this country, you watch MSNBC, you think you're getting, the stuff on the left. At Fox News, incorrectly in my view, because I'm one of the token brunettes and liberals who works there. Now we're more than tokens. There's a broad diversity of opinion within the newsroom, but within among reporters there is, but you're not. Let's get to your question. But that standard of objectivity is that, of course, we all have our biases and our prejudices and our beliefs. But the New York Times model of journalism, the Washington Post model of journalism, and the journalism which kind of was taught in our schools for a long time was that you try and compensate for your whatever personal bias you may have and be driven by the facts, by your reporting, by what you're finding out. Because of the explosion of social media, in part, but not totally, the mix between opinion journalism and fact-based journalism has pretty much, it's all blended together and it's disappearing. And people who, we used to say, you're entitled to your own opinion, you're not entitled to your own facts. Well, today you seem to be entitled to your own facts as well. And then you just get a highly polarized society and a politicized society, politicized journalism. And it's another reason I wrote the book, is I really wanted to explore that problem and look at it in terms of what happened at the New York Times. It's very, very hard. I still believe that striving for objectivity, knowing that you're not going to get there, but that you ask a series of questions and editors ask you about them, the same questions, will drive you towards the facts. But the most important thing about journalism is always going back to the story. My first story on almost anything almost always contained errors of some kind. You have to keep going back and looking. What can you learn the first time, the second time, the third time? The story evolves and the story changes, and especially in the intelligence world, you get a little bit of information. You find out there's an aluminum tube. Then you find out that the CIA diverted this aluminum tube from Jordan and that they are now examining this tube in our laboratories. You find out that the president is told there is high confidence that this tube is being used or is intended for a uranium centrifuge program. Then you find out a few days or months later that there's a debate about whether or not that's true. In other words, stories unfold. And the real crime is not getting something wrong, but sticking with your story when you know it is wrong. And that's happening more and more, too. And that's another reason I'm very upset about the "they lied, people died" meme, because we now have 3 reports that looked at that thesis and said there's no evidence of pressure on analysts, there's no evidence that anyone deliberately lied. And why Americans want to believe they were deliberately lied to rather than the fact that their intelligence communities failed them is a separate question we can debate. But the point you raise about journalism and how we've come to view it, yes, that's very much in flux. I'm very worried about the trend. I don't see Americans as being better informed today than we were 10 years ago, despite all this fancy new technology. So, yes, sir, I share your concern.
Okay. Next question.
I think I'm too short. I don't
Or
really have
the microphone is too tall.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't really have a question. I have a debate point. I was at the center of the debate on the Iraq weapons of mass destruction. I don't know what to do. To go like that? Is that? I feel like soupy sales. Does that work? In fact, there was enormous pressure. I am in the Silberman-Robb report. I was on 60 Minutes. There was enormous pressure I was the
Pressure to do what?
to confirm that there were weapons of mass destruction, particularly the mobile biological weapons labs. I was the person leading the no, there isn't. I have 2.5 feet of paper proving, and it has been reported in classified, that in fact there was a lot of pressure. So I'm not going to I'm not going to let you get away with the intelligence agencies were wrong. It was politicized. Some people got it wrong. Some of us got it right. And people in the night, who was it, Knight Ridder or McClatchy, they figured out how to validate things. They went to, I think, Oak Ridge. I can't remember. But I'm going to stand up for my on occasion.
Can you identify yourself? Can
Margaret
you tell us your-
Hennock.
Okay, I know. Oh, no.
Yeah, I thought so.
You-
So I would just for everybody else, there was enormous pressure. The Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz gang they wanted a war. I don't know why they wanted a war, but there was a lot of pressure, and I am not going to listen to somebody tell me there
Well,
wasn't.
okay.
I was there for 2 years.
I urge you to read the commission reports and make up.
Classified one.
Well, we can't.
The unclassified one isn't correct.
I urge you to read the declassified 3 different reports and draw your own conclusions. There were always people who disagreed about intelligence.
But we all heard the pressure.
Some apparently weren't convinced by that. But, I guess the question I would ask you is the question that Colin Powell asks in his, no, wait a minute. The question that Colin Powell asked in his book. Colin Powell would not talk to me for my book. And there were a number of people who wouldn't talk to me. Many of them claimed to have been doubters before. I didn't know about you, and I didn't write about the mobile labs before, or I would have tried to talk to you. But the people I did try to talk to would either not talk or would not confirm. Colin Powell, in the book called Leadership, said, and I found it very moving and disturbing, he said he gets furious when he hears now about people who doubted the intelligence that he was given and the president were given. And he asked the question in Leadership, where were these people when we were going to war? Where were these people when a dissent would have mattered? And that's his account. So, what was striking to me was that when I went back and I interviewed English intelligence, British intelligence, and Israeli intelligence, and some German intelligence, is whether or not you wanted to go to war, whether or not their country's policymakers wanted to go to war, they were not deeply divided about the presumed existence of WMD in Iraq. What they disagreed about was whether or not that was sufficient cause to go to war. And people of goodwill could disagree about the second part without challenging necessarily the first. I think that there's a lot of rewriting of history about what Americans were actually told. Before the McClatchy papers wrote a very good article on aluminum tubes, Americans already knew that that there was an intense debate within the intelligence community about the tubes. And they knew that not from McClatchy, but from Michael Gordon and me in the New York Times. Because 5 days after, Michael and I wrote the story about aluminum tubes, we learned about the debate. And we wrote that story and put it in the New York Times. And yes, I would have liked that story to have been on the front page, but it wasn't. So, I think I know if you're involved in the debate at the time, you feel strongly, and you might have felt pressure, but all people like me had to go on were what we could get at that moment, and then subsequently the findings of these different panels that, getting it wrong was just as bad.
Well, like the famous case involving Curveball.
Curveball, yeah.
The
Which
source
yeah.
and the German intelligence were saying, don't trust this guy. It's not.
Not all
It's not.
German intelligence.
Not-
That's my case. They were not all saying that, and I'm not going to drag all the rest of you
Okay.
because it's
Yeah.
boring and painful, but that is not accurate
Okay.
But
at all.
also, once again, people have different memories. Tyler Drumheller, who was an analyst, said that he was,
It was not an
Ma'am,
analyst.
ma'am,
Right.
quiet. Let her finish.
if I think it's important that if you should write an article or something about the classified part that we haven't. You've written about the classified information. So you said there was only an unclassified report. Where's your article about the classified information? Okay, I'd love to see it because I haven't seen it. Now, I did not report on mobile biological labs until we actually, the XTF, which was the group in which I was embedded in Iraq, came across one of those labs, which turned out to be for rockets. Balloons, but they were convinced, the analysts that I talked to, and I was there reporting on them as they were doing the measurements and taking the measurements, were convinced that these labs were for biological production. And Bill Broad and I wrote the first story about that. And then the CIA issued a white paper saying that. We wrote that and put it on the front page. And then I went back to Iraq in June to talk to people, one of whom is now dead, so I can name him. He was still in Britain, is David Kelly, the British biological analyst, who told me, was one of the people who told me the CIA's got it wrong. And David Kay, who led the weapons hunt and went on NBC and said, this is a biological lab, as sure as I'm standing here, he got it wrong. And he didn't lie, he got it wrong. And so we then did a third article that said, these labs actually appear to be for weather balloons, for rocketry. This stuff, look, I wrote this book so that I could talk about mistakes I made. I think it's really important to look at mistakes we make, the intelligence community makes, so we can understand how to make them, not make them again. But when you stop doing that, when you stop going back and asking the questions, that's when you fall into convenient patterns of thought that fit your ideological, preference or something you want to believe. And it's really important every now and then for all of us to get out of our comfort zone. That's what I did in this book. I showed you how these estimates were put together. I went back and I talked to some of the people who wouldn't talk to me, who were presumably doubters, and said, wouldn't you talk to me? At least one of them is in this room. And I try and go back and look at the story in the fullness of time. And I really hope that with your article and others, 10 years from now, someone else will go back and take a different look at it, and we'll have even a greater understanding of what we got right and what we got wrong. The only thing we could all agree on is, I think, that the war, as it was fought, whether or not it was justified, was an absolute disaster for this country, and a disaster we're still dealing with, which is why it's so important to keep looking at this issue.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to take all the three more questioners. If I could just group all of you with your questions, and then we'll come back to Judy to ask.
Okay, I just wanted to shift the controversy to the Valerie Plame case and ask you to explain what you did there. And
Valerie Plame.
Plame, yes. Right.
Well, that's a really good question because it's,
Do you also have a related question
to Valerie Plame?
Plame?
Okay. I'll tell you what I didn't do. I never wrote about Valerie Plame. I never wrote a story about Valerie Plame. I don't believe that my job as a journalist is outing agents. Other people can do that. People who cover the CIA can do it. I didn't think that's my job. I was told about her pretty early on, but I was so consumed when I came back with Iraq about how we got this wrong. I mean, I'd been out there with the XTF covering their search day after day, hundreds of places that they visited, coming up dry. We dug up everything from fighter jets to sofas. The Iraqis hid everything of potential value. But I came back with a list of questions about why the intelligence was so wrong, and that's what I was focused on. In the course of my questions about that, I came across a reference to Valerie Plame, and I'll tell you how it happened. In the New York Times, her husband had written a story, an op-ed page article, saying basically that's where the "they lied, people died" meme began in earnest, saying that he had gone to Niger and had looked at some of the intelligence and it wasn't what the administration said it was, and the administration was pretty much lying. That was the piece. And so I began investigating whether or not that was true, and I learned about Valerie Plame. I thought that I had learned about it when I was talking to Scooter Libby about the failed intelligence. It was only years later, after reading Valerie Plame's book, that I discovered that my testimony had been wrong because I had misinterpreted these very, very brief notes, references to her that I had in my notebook. I felt horrible. I felt absolutely consumed with guilt. I had testified against Scooter Libby. I said I'd learned it from him. I probably hadn't learned it from him. In fact, I definitely hadn't learned it from him. But when I began researching memory and what we remember, what we don't, I learned that what I had done, which is called misattribution, is one of the most common memories errors. It was also part of the Scooter Libby defense that he was never permitted to offer in any detail to the jury. And almost every witness who testified against him, actually, you can see differences between what these people told the grand jury, what they told the FBI, what they wound up testifying to. I'm very open about my views about this. I think the case, once it was determined by the CIA, and it was determined long before the indictment of Scooter Libby, that there was no damage to her, no damage to national security, no damage to any source at home or abroad. As far as I'm concerned, that investigation should have ended. But because there was a special prosecutor, it didn't end. It went on and on and on. And it consumed a huge amount of newsprint, but more than that, government time. And because I subsequently learned through interviews that Scooter Libby, very early on, was one of the few people saying, this war is going south. We are going to lose this war unless we shift strategies and adopt a surge. And just as he was trying to make that case, he was taken out by the Scooter Libby investigation.
Right.
It's a really interesting case. Armitage, the man who leaked her name, not once, but several times, if you look at the conversation with Bob Woodward, he says several times, hey, that's quite a story. Don't you think that's a story? Interesting story, don't you think? This was not a casual reference. He was never indicted. I don't know. You'll have to ask him. He's another one of the people who wouldn't talk to me, along with Patrick Fitzgerald, the prosecutor who put me in jail,
All right,
who
we
is now at
promised to
Skadden
wrap
Arps,
up
my
at 8
lover.
o'clock, but let's close out the questioning here.
First, I offer two quick corrections. Number one, 4 people leaked the identity of Valerie Plame.
Sorry?
Only one of them was indicted. And he was indicted for lying, not for perjury and obstruction of justice, not for leaking the identity.
Who leaked it?
Nobody.
Who did you
you're,
say?
You're absolutely right.
Second correction.
Yeah,
you said you-
can I just correct that? That there was no one ever charged with leaking the name of Valerie Plame. Okay.
basically because they couldn't prove that anybody knew she was in covert status.
Into the microphone.
Okay. Second quick correction. It's not that Scooter Libby wasn't allowed to present the memory loss defense. It was the judge said you're going to have to testify yourself to lay a foundation for the expert witness to testify. And Libby wouldn't testify in his own defense. Okay, so my question to you is, your key testimony, you said that when you met with Libby on June 23rd, he was discussing what he called 2 streams of reporting on uranium and efforts by Iraq and yada yada. And then he said the second stream, and at that point he said, once again as an aside, that Mr. Wilson's wife worked at the CIA agency, the sub-agency, WinPAT. So that was not correct?
No, that was not correct.
He didn't tell you that?
No, he did not. No, someone else. I had those references were in parentheses, and I had told Patrick Fitzgerald that I used parentheses for two purposes. One, to remember to ask someone I was interviewing a question about information I'd already heard, and the second was to take note of something that was interesting that the interviewee was saying that wasn't really relevant to my inquiry. So when I saw, I know it's too in the weeds, but let me just put it this way. The first reference was to bureau. Wife works at bureau. That was my question mark. Wife works at bureau. If Scooter Libby had leaked the name to me of Valerie Plame and said she worked at the agency, he would never have said she works in a bureau. Why? Because the CIA doesn't have bureaus. It has divisions, it has offices. But the State Department, which was her cover when she was a CIA agent, has bureaus. And the person who initially told me that she worked at the State Department/CIA used the word bureau. And I remembered that only after learning what her cover was. But Patrick Fitzgerald knew that information all along and never provided it to me, never provided it to Scooter Libby, which I think is more of a problem.
But that contradicts your other key statement. I have no recollection of knowing that Valerie Plame Wilson worked at the CIA before my conversation with Mr. Libby. Now you're saying you had the notes that show she did before you talked to Libby.
No, there were two conversations, and the reference to WinPAC is a second conversation. You know, the whole point of this book is not that book, which I didn't write, but this one, which I did.
All right, Judy
Okay,
will be
let me
sticking
just-
around to
yeah,
answer.
But let me just put this. Memories are faulty, and even notes are faulty. And one reason I wrote this book is I wanted to tell what I now know and have learned about Scooter Libby's case. And the more I learned about that case, the more I thought it was kind of a travesty that it had occurred with so much going on in our country at that time.
Okay, a final question, and then we'll break it off, and she'll be around to autograph books.
All right. A different question and a little off topic of your book, but certainly related to the conversation about getting it right, getting it wrong, being limited to the facts that you have at a particular point in time. I'm interested, given your experience, extensive experience in the Middle East, how do you suggest we evaluate this accord that's being negotiated with Iran?
Well, okay, we might as well stick around for breakfast.
Actually, it's a pretty short answer with great skepticism. I mean, we think we know about the Ayatollah's motivations. I don't. I don't know what he means when he says that he intends for Iran to have 190,000 spinning centrifuges by 2020 or whatever the time is. I don't know what his real capabilities are. I know we found 2 facilities that he hid, that he lied about, that Iran lied about all those times. I think on Fox News, I've taken the position that I'm not going to condemn an agreement I haven't seen. And when I defended the interim agreement, I thought that was a very good thing that was very much in our country's interests. I think it's worked out well. But I think we have to wait and see what the president comes up with. And, I don't know what that's going to be. I know that at the moment, the Ayatollah and the U.S. Congress are not making his life and that effort any easier. But I just urge you once again, we've had many estimates of Iranian capability. I'm not persuaded, given what I saw in Iraq, that we know much more about Iran than we knew about Iraq. I hope we do, but I wouldn't count on it. And I'm not actively reporting that right now anyway.
There's plenty more material in the book, so we hope you will buy the book and buy it here in support of the wonderful work that Brad and Lissa do at Politics and Prose. So thank you all for coming, and thanks to you.
Thank you very much.